So nobody gets it, but it's obvious that the center of town to meet people in the Middle East, in the desert, was the well. I mean, there's no running water, right? So at some point, everyone has to get back to the well. By the time every evening we read it with the story of Rebecca. Every evening the girls would go, and here you can read about the shepherds would come during the day, midday. So that's why Moshe comes to Midian, which is basically southern Jordan. He goes to the well. Everyone goes to the well. That's the place to go. So the same thing, if you want to meet a girl, you go to the well. And that's exactly what happens here. He shows up to the well. And at the well, as we mentioned last week, it's the middle of the day, and there are three shepherds that have flock, and they're all sitting around the well, and Jacob has the conversation with them. And we discussed this last week a little bit, some of the conversation. What's the purpose? Why does the Torah elaborate upon this conversation? What do we glean from this? And last week we mentioned two things. Number one, we said that it shows you the distrust between the people, right? There's no trust between the people. So instead of saying everybody can take water and whatever, be fair to the next guy behind you. Here they put a stone that nobody could take water on their own. The entire town has to be there for anybody to take water. That's what it seems like, right? That's what they say. All the adarim, all the roim, all the flocks, and all the shepherds have to show up in order to move the stone, which means that they didn't trust anybody. Maybe there'll be a group that will come early. So the point here is that could be one possible interpretation, the distrust between the people. And it's important to the story because that helps us understand that Lavan is not afraid to trick Jacob and give him the wrong daughter in the presence of his whole town. Remember, they printed wedding invitations, I presume, right? And they said Rachel's getting married. Because if it didn't say Rachel, if it said Leah's getting married, then Jacob wouldn't show up, right? So he calls part of the story is that Rashi says that Lavan calls the verse says Lavan calls the entire city. That's what the verse says. I think Rashi says that's part of the deception. But in any case, and then the entire city shows up and they come to this wedding of Rachel, and the morning it's Leah. So nobody thinks it's strange that Jacob that Lavan is tricking his son-in-law. Right? So we have to put us into the mood of what kind of community this is. And the distrust between people, the expectation that's a normal thing to try to trick people, could be that's the purpose of this conversation of this well. That's what we said last week. Another thing we said last week was that you see their attitude toward the outsider. He is trying to be friendly. He's referring to them, my brothers. He's saying peace upon to you. He keeps trying to engage in conversation, and they're answering as little as possible, and they don't respond with a question. Right? If I ask you, how are you, or what's your name, I expect you to ask me the same thing, and they're not taking the bait. Right? It's actually funny when you read it that way, as you mentioned last week. It's like he has to start up the conversation every time, and again, that could be what the verse is telling us. Then we can go to the Medrash, and that's what we'll do this week. I don't have to open my notes because I don't remember the Medrash, but the Medrash says no, that there's significance here. You have a well, and you have three shepherds, and you have to get water from the well, and there's an obstacle on the well. And the Medrash goes all kinds of this well is a symbol for many different things. And again, some of them seem a little abstract, like what does it have to do with here? Far-fetched is the word I'm looking for. But I guess the reason why the Medrash is offering all these interpretations is because the underlying question is, why is it so important to know how many shepherds were there in the conversation? That doesn't really advance the plot. You should just say, could have just said he comes to the water, he comes to the water, and he sees Rachel, and that's the plot, right? You don't need this entire conversation. We're talking about almost 10 verses, really more, 11, 12. We're reading 12 verses. You could have just said one verse. He came to the water, he met Rachel, and that's it. So that seems to me that's why the Medrash is offering all kinds of symbolism, because they feel like there must be more to the story. So I think we'll do that we'll start with that. I'll read a few points from the Medrash, and then we'll see. You tell me which one you like, right? And then you say which one you like best, and then we'll see from there.
Rabbi, I think aside from the spiritual connotation of the stone, I think it was fairly. I think it was practiced to cover wells to prevent contamination.
Yeah, you want to cover the well. That's correct. But why, with a covering, that you have to have the entire, all the shepherds have to come? It's too heavy. you put a stone that's very heavy, that you need all the people of the towns, all the shepherds together to move it, which means everyone has to be there before anyone could move the whatchamacallit, expose the water, reveal the water. As opposed to a stone that's not so heavy, 2 or 3 people could move it. I remember when we did a renovation in our house, my parents, so there was this stone, they were trying to do something in the garden, and there was this massive stone in the garden that took like 10 people like 3 days to move. And they think it was in the foundation of the house, but when they built the house 100 years ago, they didn't want to move it, so just put it into the garden and covered it with stone. But in any case, I could picture that stone right now when I was 10 years old. I could see a stone that you literally need the entire town to move. So why are you taking that stone? Okay, so the Torah doesn't say why, but it says the facts. The facts are, he says, we need all the shepherds to move it. And then Jacob comes and moves it. Okay, fine. Well, that's another angle. What is that? What is the significance of that? But the bottom line is that in the story, at least the story, the way it's told by the shepherds, because Jacob says, why are you sitting in the middle of the day? It's not the time to bring the sheep in. Go out and pasture. Right? And they say we can't. We need to give everybody we need everybody to expose the water. Go ahead, Bob, please.
Good morning, Rabbi. Just before you get started, we know that the Bible is so precise, every word, whatever. Can you give us the bird's eye view as to, or dive into the drains, so to speak, and see why we're spending so much time on plumbing in the Bible?
What do you mean by plumbing?
Wells, water, lids.
Yeah, so that's what the Medrash is going to try to do. The Medrash reads the story and says it must be something more significant happening here. And the question is, how come? So what is the symbolism? So what's bothering you is bothering the Medrash. Now, there's all kinds of interpretations, and some are far-fetched. It's not pshat at all. You'll see some of the examples. I'll bring 2, 3 examples. I'll read it inside because I don't remember them by heart, and you'll see that it's far-fetched. What's this got to do with Jacob? But I think, like I said, what the Medrash is troubled with is what Bob is just saying. Why are we spending so much time? So the simple level is just the plot. It's just the plot. We need to put Jacob with Rachel, and they have to meet up somewhere, and there has to be a conversation. You also have to find out. We know why Jacob loves Rachel, because Rachel is beautiful. But why does Rachel love Jacob? Oh, he's mighty. Okay, how is he so strong? You know that well, that that stone, that you need everybody, all the shepherds in the entire town to come and move. He could move it on his own. Oh, so he must be strong and handsome. That's why she loves him. It doesn't say that in the verse, but I can understand if you're looking at the Torah just as a literary work, then it makes sense why you want to tell the story. But we insist that that's not the case, that there has to be significance. So the question is, what is the significance? So that's why we have to get together on Sunday morning and read the Medrash to figure out what is the symbolism. Now, water, of course, is a symbol for life, and that's why a lot of the marriages are happening with the well. Well is water. Well is a symbol for life. Stone is the obstacle. There are obstacles to get to the water. In Jacob's life, to get to the water, the obstacles are going to take place. So really, if you really want to think about it, you would expect Jacob to face the obstacle that nobody else can face. You need all the townspeople. No single person could face the tests that Jacob is going to face. And yet Jacob prevails. And we know about that in the beginning, the first page of the story. And that will play out in the rest of the parsha. Because the rest of the parsha is, again, Jacob has many obstacles to building a family, beginning with his father-in-law cheating him, but also with the idea that his wife, at least Rachel, is barren. And the bottom line is that there's an obstacle to the water. The water is symbolism for life and general blessing. And Jacob is going to remove the obstacle. So I would say, even before we get into any specific interpretation, that image is one of Jacob prevailing obstacle, and that's signaling to us that what's going to happen in the rest of the story, at least in the rest of the parsha. So that's what I would say. Okay, so I'm reading the Medrash, but I only made this introduction to tell me so you don't get upset that it's so far-fetched, because it's not pshat, it's not the simple meaning, but I think it's addressing the reader's concern, like why are we spending so much time on the well. So I'm going to read a little bit. Okay, I'll try to translate as best as I can. You get a little Aramaic here. Here we go. Okay, so the first thing the Medrash says, Chama Bar Chanina, they say, look, this is a well. It's a reference to the well that's going to happen later on in the Torah. When the Jewish people left Egypt, they're traveling through the desert, they need water. So we had the well of Miriam. So he says like this, there's a well in the field. That refers to the well that the Jewish people would drink from when they left Egypt. Then it says there are three flocks of sheep. 3 flocks of sheep, says the Medrash, Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. These are the 3 leaders of the Jewish people. The shepherd is the leader. So when the Jewish people, when Jacob comes to the scene, he sees the well. That's the well where the Jewish people are going to drink from. There are 3 shepherds. Who are the 3 shepherds that took the Jewish people out of Egypt? Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. It's interesting that even though the Torah doesn't say specifically that Miriam is one of the 3 shepherds, you always see Moshe and Aaron. Miriam was there in the background, but she's not classified as a shepherd. But in the prophets, in one of the Haftarahs, I forget which one, in one of the Haftarahs, when God, the prophet, retells the story of the Exodus, God says, and I sent you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. So it sort of puts the 3 on the same level in the position of leadership. In any case, what is the big stone? So he says that when the Jewish people would travel, then the stone, sort of the water didn't produce, or the water wasn't revealed. Once they set up camp, that's when the water gave water. That's what he says. That's the idea of having all the camps present. All the camps is when they set up camp, because in the desert, they were either traveling or camped. So when it would travel, it was not visible. And then when they would come back, when they would camp, then the well would come back to its strength. In other words, it's a miraculous well. It traveled with them. It's a miracle. So it travels with them. So that's the idea. The idea is that you need all the camps set up to be a vessel for the divine miracle of the water of the well in the desert. So that's the meaning of all the sheep have to come. In other words, we have to set up camp. We have to build a Mishkan and have all the camps around and all the Jewish people around. And then when you have the full camp, then we're sort of a vessel for the divine blessing. That is the first interpretation that the Medrash offers. Next interpretation. Be'er, what's the well? Where we get water, we get sustenance. That is Zion. In this case, it says Zion, meaning Jerusalem. And then you have 3 sheep. So if I mention Jerusalem and I say 3, what do you think about? The 3 pilgrimage holidays. Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, when the Jewish people would come to the well to drink water. That's a reference to the Jewish people coming to Zion, to Jerusalem, to get, to draw water. But in Hebrew, to draw water is not just, so it's to draw water, but it's also to draw inspiration. Same word, to draw. Also in English, we know that the holiday of on Sukkot, they had the big celebration on the nights of Sukkot where they would draw water, and then they would pour the water on the altar in the morning, and there was a whole all-night celebration. And the Talmud says, if you haven't seen that celebration, you haven't seen any celebration in your days. The Talmud says that's where they also drew. They drew Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration, or divine, a degree of prophecy. So in any case, all that is tied into that coming to the well to draw. And then that's why you have the three flocks as the 3 holidays. Okay, let's continue. Yeah.
I think it was one of
There's a child.
Oh, did she want to get in?
Well,
Oh,
she saw it and she ran away.
Okay, we scared her away. Okay, fine. And then all the sheep would come, of course, so we have the 3 shepherds that are sitting there. That represents the 3 holidays. And then it says, V'nesu shama kol hadarim, all the flock would come. And that's the Jewish people coming from the entirety of Israel, all over Israel. And that's the second interpretation. So what do we have so far? We have the Jewish people leading Egypt. And we have the 3 shepherds are Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. That's interpretation number 1. Interpretation number 2, what is the water? The water is Zion. The water is Jerusalem. The water is the divine inspiration that the Jewish people get when they go to the temple on the 3 pilgrimage holidays. That's interpretation number 2. Interpretation number 3, we're going to get to, it actually refers to the court. In other words, the divine presence that rests in the Beit Din, in the court. Court is the place that adjudicates the Torah, the divine will. You just see the spectrum of opinions. What is water? Bob wants to know, what does water represent? Well, everybody values something else. One values leadership, That's the first interpretation. Second one values Zion. That's the greatest thing, Jerusalem. So he says that's what the water is. Third one says Torah. So he says the courts. Why the courts? He's going to play it out. But I'm just showing you the spectrum. Okay, so how do you get to 3 courts? So he says like this. It says in the Talmud that there's a court in every city. The verse says, you should put officers and courts and judges in all your gates, meaning in all your cities. But the way it was set up, the sort of the court of appeals, the way the layers of courts was set up, that there were 3 courts. There were 3 batidim, 3 courts in the Temple Mountain. One on Temple Mountain, one at the opening of the Azara, which is the courtyard of the temple, and one is the Supreme Court sat in a chamber called Lishkat HaGazit. So in other words, once you get to the temple, which is the sort of the circuit courts and the courts of appeals, there are 3 courts of appeals in the temple, 3 layers. And then he says, when it says that from there they would draw water, that's where the people got the deen, got the law. And then there's a great stone. So he says the great stone is the Beit Din Haggadah of the Supreme Court. I would think it's the opposite. I would think the great stone is the obstacle. It's a challenge to derive what the law is. But okay. And then he says all the flocks gathered there, the lower courts, if they were not sure about a matter of law, they would come up to Jerusalem to get the matter of law, to understand the law. And then they would put the law back. They would put the stone back, meaning they set up the law on its foundation. In other words, they declare what the law is.
Would it be fair to say that we can expand upon that number 3 and that a basin has 3 diamonds? Typically?
Yeah. But a typical basin had 3. These had more than 3 though. The courts of appeals had 23. And the Supreme Court had 71.
However, today.
I'm sorry, today they have 3. Also, then they had 3, but the lower courts had 3.
Correct.
So because you need a majority, and you need a majority, so you need an odd number. But when it came to a court that can rule with capital punishment, you needed 23. Because you need an Ada, you need a minion, you need a presence. You need a presence of considered a spiritual endeavor to judge capital case. It's a serious matter. You need a divine help, so you need a minion. But then we always the Talmud talks about in the Tractate Sanhedrin that the verse implies that the Ada, the community, will prosecute and the community will defend. So theoretically, you need to have 10 judges that are able to prosecute and 10 judges that are able to offer defense. That's 20, but 20 is even number, so you add 3. They end up with 23. That's how the Talmud gets. So those are the higher courts that could rule capital crimes. And then above that was the Sanhedrin. Okay, we can continue going, but you get the point. The point is that it goes to the extent that he says the final one is the well in the field. Lest you're nervous that right now we don't have Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, and we don't have the pilgrimage in Jerusalem, at least the way it used to be. We don't have the temple, and we don't have the courts. We don't have the Supreme Court in Israel, the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court. So how does it apply to us? So finally, at the end, we have one interpretation that's applicable today as well. It says like this. He says, the final one is the well in the field is the Beit Knesset, the synagogue. And there are 3 flocks of sheep. These are the 3 people that are called to the Torah in the weekday. When we read the Torah Monday and Thursday, you get 3 people called to the Torah. And because from the well, everybody would drink. Everybody hears the Torah in the Beit Knesset, in the study hall, in the synagogue. And then there's a big stone, which is the obstacle. That's the evil inclination. Yetzer hara, the blocking us from accessing the waters of the Torah. Everybody gets together. He says the Hatzibur, that's the congregation. When you're alone, it's harder to battle the evil inclination. But if you're together with other people, the inspiration of the community helps you overcome your own inner obstacle. Fascinating. And then they would move the stone. That's where they hear the words of Torah. And then, this is very funny, then when everyone goes home, the stone goes back, the evil inclination reappears. You can't get rid of it forever. So all I'm trying to show by reading this is that you see, everybody's troubled by Bob's question, what is the well? And then everybody says something else. The Medrash, the first one is quoted by name, but after that just says Davar Acher, another opinion, and they offer all kinds of opinions. But the bottom line is the well is what's valuable, and then you need 3 to access it. Leadership, you need the 3 leaders. You want to know what is the God's will as defined by the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin are the ones that the final adjudicators of the Torah. Remember that in the days of the Sanhedrin, there were no disagreements. There was no machloket. There's no disagreement in the Torah. Because if any matter of disagreement makes its way up to the Supreme Court, and then there's a vote, and then the matter is settled. The idea that there's so much disagreement in Torah appears only once the Sanhedrin has been disbanded, right? So the Sanhedrin is a very important institution in Judaism, and it's also the idea that that's where you get the word of God, because they ultimately adjudicate the opinion of the Torah. So that's the water, and others say, as we mentioned, it's going to the temple, going to Jerusalem at the pilgrimage, and finally going to shul. You go to shul, you hear the Torah reading, that's you're getting the access of the water. There's obstacle, but dominion, the power of the community, helps us get rid of the evil inclination, and then we drink the water. But don't worry, it's coming back. Don't worry, it comes back when you're done. Reminds me of a funny story. I once read an article about it. It happens to be my cousin, but whatever, doesn't matter. The fact that he's my cousin it's not relevant. The point is that in the late 60s, that Rebbe sent yeshiva students to strengthen the yeshiva in Melbourne, Australia. And at that point, to travel to Melbourne was a big deal. They went for 2 years. They left their homes for 2 years, and they went away from the Rebbe's court to Melbourne. It was a big deal to leave. But the Rebbe said that if you go, you're going on a very important mission to establish a yeshiva. So you have divine help, and you'll be able to inspire yourself and inspire others, and everybody was so happy to go. So I read an article by the person who went, one of the people who went. He said, we got onto the plane and was so inspired, and we get there and we land there. And he says, after a few days, I realized that with me on the flights, the evil inclination also came along on the flights. Right? So you could be inspired, you could fly, but he also came along. So that reminds me that after you finish davening, you put the stone back, that the evil inclination comes with you also on the flight. So don't worry, he'll keep you busy tomorrow as well. So I guess the advice is to go to shul tomorrow as well. Okay. So that's the story. That's, again, what do we see here? We see here that we're not the only ones troubled of what this well represents. And people are trying to read this and make it relevant to what was important to them, either in their own personal understanding of what is the most important aspect of Judaism, right? Is it personal prayer? Is it the community? Is it historically Moshe taking the Jews out of Egypt, Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam? Is it the study of Torah, which is the Sanhedrin? Is it going to the pilgrimage, etc.? So everybody is looking at this from another angle. Which one is right? Of course, you know my answer. They're all correct. Okay, so that's for that. Now we're going to go to a very interesting verse. First verse of chapter, actually even before the well. Let me just share the screen so we get to take a little peek at it. Now Jacob lifted his feet and went to the land of the people of the east. What does it mean? He lifted his feet. So I know dragged his feet is a statement, is an expression in English. You go when you don't want to go, you drag your feet. But the question is lifting your feet in English? I don't know. I don't think so. I never heard of it. So what does it mean that you lift your feet? So here we have Rashi. Says Rashi, it's on the screen. As soon as he was given the good tidings that he was assured protection, his heart lifted his feet and he became fleet-footed. So it is explained in Genesis Rabbah. In other words, it's the opposite of dragging your feet. If you are confident and you're upbeat about your mission, then you go quickly. And there's a bounce. What do they call it? There's a bounce in your steppers, right? So you're excited to go. You're happy to go, and that basically the Torah is telling us that he was reassured. Hashem's promise in the vision, the ladder, and then the promise to him subsequently in the dream that reassured him and gave him the hope that he's going to be okay, even though he's going on a difficult mission, and therefore he lifted his feet. So that's the basic interpretation. Then you get to the Hasidic interpretation. The Hasidic interpretation says he lifted his feet. What does feet represent? So feet represents the most physical part of the person, the one that is sort of planted on the earth. Lifting it, sort of making it higher to the head, represents you're creating an awareness. The head is the awareness. And basically for Jacob, whatever he does in the physical world, he's doing for a purpose. He's doing for a reason. And he's sanctifying it, because we know that the Hasidic understanding is that every physical action, it depends whether or not it's considered holy or not, depends what's the purpose of it, why you're doing it. If you're doing it for its own sake, it's not considered holy. But that same action, if you're doing it for the sake of heaven, for a higher purpose, then that same action could become holy. So metaphorically, I'm raising my feet to the level of head means that the actions I take in the physical world, if they have the awareness of the mind, then that's raising it up, lifting it up, and making it holy. So that's just a little mysticism on the morning. Okay. Okay, so let's read a few verses and we'll see the story and we'll see what we want to focus on. So we read these verses, I think. We read the first bunch of verses about the shepherds back and forth. They say, he asked them, how you doing? Do you know Rachel? Do you know Laban? And they say, yeah, here is they say Rachel is coming. They say Rachel, his daughter, is coming. That's in verse 6. He continues talking to them, verse 7, 8, 9. And verse 10, he finally sees Rachel. And it came to pass, when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, that Jacob drew near and rolled the rock off the mouth of the well, and he watered the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother. And Jacob kissed Rachel, and he raised his voice and wept. And Jacob told Rachel that he was his father's kinsman, and that he was Rebekah's son, and she ran and told her father. Now it came to pass, when Laban heard the report of Jacob, his sister's son, that he ran toward him, and he embraced him, and he kissed him, and he brought him into his house. He told Laban all these happenings. And Laban said to him, indeed, you are my bone and my flesh. And so he stayed with him a full month, free lodging for a month. And Laban said to Jacob, because you are my kinsman, should you work for me for greatest, for free? Tell me what your rate shall be. What should I pay you? So now we get into the story of Rachel and Leah. So the verse continues, verse 16. Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah. The name of the younger was Rachel. Verse 17. Leah's eyes were tender, but Rachel was beautiful features and a beautiful complexion. Jacob loved Rachel, and he said, I will work for you for 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. And Laban said, it is better that I give her to you than I should give her to another man. Stay with me. So Jacob worked for Rachel for 7 years, but they appeared to him like a few days because of his love for her. Then Jacob says, I want to get married. And Laban gathers all the people of the town to make a party. And right, let me read another few verses, then we go back. And Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife, for my days are completed, and I may come to her. 7 years later. So Laban gathered all the people of the place, and he made a feast. And it came to pass in the evening that Laban took his daughter Leah, and he brought her to him, and he came to her. And Laban gave Zilpah, his maidservant, to his daughter Leah as a maidservant. And it came to pass in the morning, and behold, she was Leah. So he said to Laban, what is this that you have done to me? Did I not work for you for Rachel? Why have you deceived me? And Laban said, it is not done so in our place to give the younger one before the firstborn. Can't marry off the younger one. So he has a deal. He says, complete the wedding week of this one. That's one of the sources in the Torah for 7 days of Sheva Bracha, 7 days of rejoicing that you do after the wedding. He says, after this week, and we will give you this one too, for the work that you will render me for another 7 years. So he married Rachel a week later, but he'll have to work for another 7 years after that. And Jacob did so, and he completed the week of this one, and he gave his daughter Rachel to his wife, and to him as a wife. And Laban gave his daughter Rachel to the maidservant Bilhah for a maidservant. And he came also to Rachel, and he also loved Rachel more than Leah. And he worked with him yet another 7 years. Okay. So that is the story of the marriage. Later we'll get to the story of the sons, but this we still have what to cover in these verses. So where to begin? So let's look about, this is something I read this year for the first time. I thought it was very cute. So Laban has to justify his trickery, his deceitfulness. So let's see what he tells, when Jacob approaches him, and he says, why did you give me Leah? I worked for you for Rachel. So he says, I have no choice. That's the local custom. I can't change the local custom. But you should have told that to me the first time. You should have told me that 7 years earlier. It's nice they tell me 7 years later. So you say, well, he's just a trickster. But then I read this year from the Malbim a beautiful concept that Laban was very, very clever. And legally, he actually did not agree to what Jacob offered. It looked like he did, but he did not. And I'll tell you, I'll make a confession. I read this verse probably 30 times in the past 30 years, every year. But I never noticed this subtlety. So let's go back. So Rachel, so Jacob offers a deal. What does Jacob say? Because Laban says, what do you want for payments? So where am I looking at? Okay. So he says, verse 18. And Jacob loved Rachel. Let me just open the Rashi. Give me just a second. So verse 18. And Jacob loved Rachel, and he said, I will work for you for 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. So before we even get to the subtleties, what does Rashi say? Why do you have to say Rachel, your daughter? Rachel, your daughter, the younger. So if you're a lawyer, you know that when you write a contract, you have to spell everything out. So Rashi says, as far, it's actually very funny. Says Rashi, for Rachel, your younger daughter, why were all these signs necessary? Could have just said for Rachel. Says Rashi, since Jacob knew that Laban was a deceiver, he said to him, I will work for you for Rachel. Unless you say that I meant another Rachel from the street, right? I said, I'm working for Rachel. And 7 years later, you'll find another Rachel on the street and bring it to me. So scripture states your daughter. So not only Rachel, but your daughter. Now, lest you say, I will change her name to Leah, and I will name her Leah Rachel. I'll change the names. Scripture states your younger daughter. Nevertheless, it did not avail him, for Laban deceived him. In other words, he was being very careful. He drew up a contract. So it wasn't a written contract, but it was an oral contract. But the bottom line is, he says, he's very clear about what he wants. He says, I'm going to work for you for 7 years for Rachel, but not just a Rachel, your daughter, but not just your daughter, but your younger daughter. By the way, in modern Hebrew, if you want to say an expression for spelling something out, like telling somebody something like explicitly, you go to Tel Aviv and you say this expression, Berachel bitcha haktana, in Rachel, your younger daughter. And a lot of people have no idea. I'm saying the Israelis who use it have no idea what the context is. But that's what it is. If you want to say you're being either upfront or abrupt, or you're just being explicit, that's the expression. Berachel bitcha haktana. In Rachel, your younger daughter, you're not leaving anything to chance, not leaving anything to understanding. You're spelling everything out exactly to the T. Okay. And it didn't help him because he deceived him. Okay. Says the Malbim. Why didn't he deceive? He didn't really. Says the Malbim. He made believe he accepted the offer. But if you read verse 19, you will realize that Jacob, that Laban never agreed to the offer. Why? What would you expect? Verse 18, Jacob says, I will work for you for 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. What's the response that Laban should say?
Yes.
Okay, yes. Instead, he gives a speech. By the way, when someone gives you a speech, they're not saying yes. That's what you know. What does he say? And Laban said, it is better that I give her to you than I should give her to another man. Stay with me.
There's no chronology attached to it.
No chronology. No idea that it's also going to be in response to working, right? Because in verse 18, Jacob says, I will work for you for 7 years. He used the term titi. Latet is matana, as gift. So it's like, it's better that I gift her to you than I should gift her to somebody else. Okay? Meaning he's not responding, first of all, to the time. He's not responding to the concept that this is payment for work. He doesn't say that. He just says, it's better for me to give her to you than to give it to somebody else. I remember, give is gift. Latet is matana. In biblical Hebrew, anytime you give, it's related to the word for gift. And if you earn something, it's a different word. You're not giving, right? You're paying. It's a different word. So the point here is, says the Malbim, that Laban at the outset, Jacob, of course, doesn't realize this because he doesn't think like a scam artist, but at least not yet. Later, maybe he'll learn. But the bottom line is, this is very clever because he doesn't say yes. He gives a speech. What does that even mean? It's better for me to give her to you than to give her to somebody else. Sit with me. It's not a yes. That's not an agreement. That's not an acknowledgement. And therefore, later when he has to wiggle out of the deal, he says there's no deal. So I thought that was clever. I never saw that till this year. Another interesting verse that a lot of people have trouble with is verse 20. So Jacob worked for Rachel 7 years, but they appeared to him like a few days because of his love to her. So does this resonate? If you really love somebody, then the time 7 years feels like 7 days, or the opposite. You would expect him to want to feel like a very long time. If you're longing for somebody and you have to wait 7 years, you would expect it to a short period of time to feel like a long time, not the opposite. See what I'm saying? If you really want something to happen, then you're anticipating and you can't wait, and every minute is like an hour. Here it says, because he loves you so much, so 7 years was like 7 days because he loved her. So what? Because he loved her, therefore he didn't mind to wait for 7 years? Doesn't sound like that. It doesn't sound like the right expression to express love, at least according to some people. So I'll read what the Malbim says, and he says something very interesting. He says that like this. He says two things. First thing he says is that he feels like he got a bargain because he valued Rachel so much. So he feels like he should have worked for her for much longer. So the 7 years is like 7 days. In other words, he doesn't feel like he's working for a long time compared to how much he valued her and how much he wanted her. So that's what we mean by this expression, that it was like a few days. 7 years was like a few days, meaning he would theoretically be willing to work for more. That's the first thing he says. Second thing is like this. He says there's two types of love. We talk about this sometimes. He says if a love is self-oriented, he loves Rachel because of how that feels to him, then it doesn't work that way. Then it doesn't make sense that the years should be like days, because if you're looking for yourself, you want it immediately. Okay, but the verse says it was like 7 years were like a few days, ba'avato ota, because he loved her. In other words, it wasn't really about him, it was about her. And in that sense, he didn't mind waiting because she wasn't ready, or whatever the case is. So they say this is the different types of love. So if I love because of myself, and he quotes the idea that usually love returns to the lover. I love you because of what it does for me. But if it's about me, then this statement doesn't make sense. That 7 years, because you love a person so much, so 7 years is like a few days. It should be the opposite. Every minute should be painful. Every minute feels like a year. But because it wasn't about him, it was about her. Ba'avato ota, because he loved her, so it's about her. So then he doesn't mind the wait because it's not self-oriented. Other people also say that she was also very young at the time. So the wait is built in. In other words, he has to wait for her anyway. But the point here is that it's not, the statement is strange. The statement, it says, because you love somebody, so you don't mind to wait for a long time. It sounds the opposite. If I love someone, I want them immediately. Well, it all depends why you want them, for yourself or for them. So that's what the Malbim said. I thought that was interesting. Okay, now we get to a little bit of we have to go a little mysticism, a little big picture here. We're going to go back to a second and look at how Rashi describes Rachel and Leah, and then we'll just do a little bit of the general story. So, verse 17, Leah's eyes were tender. Oh, go ahead, Vicky. Vicky, go ahead, please. No, you're still muted.
Sorry. Thank you, Rabbi. I just had a comment about the type of love that Jacob had, because it kind of ties to the time that he first met her, he was so inspired that he was so strong to lift the stone.
Right.
So and that's kind of special kind of love. So it's not, yeah, so that I think both of those interpretations kind of tie together.
Yes, thank you, yeah.
I don't know if anybody was interpreting that the first meeting that way, but I think it looked like to
First
me.
meeting was strange. The first meeting is strange. The first meeting is,
Yeah. I mean, this is one of the interpretations, but that's the first thing that comes to mind. Kind
Right.
of, and analyze the shot.
yeah, that first meeting is, we could talk about, maybe we'll go back to the first meeting in a few minutes or next week. The first meeting is again, you can read it as this basic simple love story. He sees her, he loves her, he cries. But why is cry doesn't seem like the right expression? Kisses her, I understand, but cries. So Rashi quotes the Medrash that he sees that, he senses that they're not going to be buried together because Rachel was buried on the road, right? But that's not the simple pshat. So it seems like the tears have to be interpreted. Okay, we'll leave that for another time. Okay, Mark asks a good question, but we have to think about that. If the people are so bad, why will you keep going back to this place to find a wife? Okay, let's think about that. In other words, that's the challenge. That's the problem. The problem is that the local. It seems like both Abraham and last generation and this generation, we say that the character of the people of Canaan was totally corrupt, their character. So therefore, both Abraham and Rebecca want to go back to Haran to find a wife. So what about the people of Haran? We just spent an hour talking about how bad they were. So there's really two ways you could think about it. First way you could think about it is the people of Haran were kind. In other words, generally speaking, there could be exceptions, but generally speaking, they were kind people. And therefore, their character, their natural character was fitting to join Abraham's family. Their belief system may have been corrupt, but their character, their natural character was refined. That's one way. And then some of what I said today would not be consistent with that, because I'm reading the story, at least at the beginning of the story, that the shepherds are not kind and accepting to the stranger. The alternative way of reading it is that when Abraham and Rebecca say go back to Haran, they mean go back to their family. They're not, so it's not a character statement for the entire city. It's a character statement of their own family. And therefore, in that family, Laban is the outlier, but the family is generally kind. Now, when you get to Abraham, it's not so simple, because we discussed this in the past. And Abraham tells Eliezer, at least explicitly, he doesn't say my family. Eliezer says my family. Today we can debate. But about Rebecca, we can also debate. But when Isaac calls his son, right? Rebecca goes to her husband and he says, Katzti b'chayai. He says, I am disgusted with my life on account of the daughters of hate. If Jacob takes a wife of the daughters of hate like these, of the daughters of the land, what is life to me? So she tells her husband, I don't want Jacob marrying the daughters of hate. What does Isaac do? So listen carefully to Isaac's mandate. So Isaac summoned Jacob and blessed him. He instructed him and said to him, do not take a wife from the Canaanite woman. Arise, go to Paddan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take a wife from there, from the daughters of Laban, your mother's father. Okay. So when Isaac sends Jacob, it's clearly not to the entire city, a region, saying that they're good people, go take from their daughters. Oh, but with Isaac and Jacob, it's specific to the family. Take from the family of your mother. And he was never there. So the only way he judged the family was from his mother. And Rebecca was certainly kind, that we know from the story of the camels, right? She gave the water to Eliezer. So Isaac, the bottom line is, you can read the story and say that Isaac wants a specific choice from from their family. So in that case, we would say if the family is kind, Laban would be the outlier. Go ahead.
But we've discussed this in the past that Rivka is also problematic and controversial because she encourages Jacob to lie to his father.
Correct, but you could make a mistake by talking about kind character. Is she a kind character? Is she someone that a young girl is going to feed a stranger water and feed 10 of his camels when she wasn't asked to? So that was considered a test of character, and she's a person of kindness, and she was a person of kindness. In fact, sometimes kind people have to go to trickery because they don't have the strength to confront. Right? If they see an injustice, that sometimes kind people, not always, but sometimes kind people, and this is not a justification, this is just a description. Sometimes kind people are very soft. So they don't want to, so they don't confront the problem. They don't want to say, she didn't want to say anything bad about Esav because she's too kind. So instead, she does something that's less than moral, less than morally sound. Now, is that the right choice and not the right choice? We're not getting into that. But I'm just saying, I don't think, to me, what she did over there is actually consistent with the characteristic of a kind person. That doesn't mean that it's right. Kind and right don't always add up. Sometimes you have kindness in the wrong way, and it's not the right thing. Right? Sometimes you need discipline. But I think as a test of character, we know her test of character because of the story of the water, and feeding, watering the camels. But there's the story of tricking her husband. Does that to me, it doesn't really go against the character trait of kindness / softness / not wanting to confront and tell somebody else about that she thinks negatively about his son that he loves. Right? To me, it's the same character. It's the same. What's the word I'm looking for? It's the same profile person that could do both. That's just me. Okay, back to Leah and Rachel. So Leah's eyes were tender. What does tender mean? What does tender mean? What is it good? Is it bad? Right? Verse 17. Rachel was beautiful features and a beautiful complexion. But what does tender mean? Raka is soft. Is that good or bad? So let's read what Rashi says. Because she expected to fall into Esav's lot, and she wept. So tender, Rashi says that comes from crying. If you cry a lot, your eyes are tender. So she was always crying. Why was she always crying? Because she expected to fall into Esav's lot, and she wept. Because everyone was saying, Rebecca has 2 sons, and Laban has 2 daughters. The older daughter for the older son, and the younger daughter for the younger son. Comes from the Talmud Bava Batra. In other words, everybody was trying to make the shidduch. Everyone was trying to make this match. And everyone said, we have an easy one. We have cousins. We have Rebecca has 2 sons. Laban has 2 daughters. Let the older one marry the older one. Let the younger one marry the younger one. So Rachel's very happy. And Leah is upset and crying because she doesn't want to marry Esav. That is how Rashi reads the story. Now, what does that do for us? Does that help us? Does that advance us? Does that help us to the big picture? Is it a specific point? So many people read this as this is actually telling for the entire story and probably for the entire history, probably for the entire book of Genesis, but maybe even for the entire history. So what's really happening here? We want to think about what does Leah represent? What does Rachel represent? The breakdown between the two, why Jacob has to want to marry Rachel, but he ends up actually marrying Leah. In fact, most of his children come from Leah. I guess most surviving Jews today are from Leah, from Judah. That's why we're called Jews, not from Rachel, not from the beloved. He doesn't end up being buried with Rachel. He ends up being buried with Leah, and so much more will be explained. Based on the kernel is in this Rashi, we're just going to expand it a little bit. Okay, so that is the task for the next 5 minutes. So we can pack in the next 5 minutes. First thing we want to say is that Jacob steals, based on this Rashi, Leah belongs to Esav. Rachel belongs to Yaakov, to Jacob. Okay. It's not, one way to think about this is that because Jacob takes his brother's blessings, means in some sense he's taking his spiritual mission as well. Right? Because what are we saying? We're saying we I don't want to go back too far, but we say Jacob has, the father Isaac has a vision for Esau. There's a vision for Esau and a vision for Jacob. And Rebecca thinks that Esau is not capable of living up to his mission. So we have to give Jacob also Esau's blessings. So even before we get into the details of what they represent, if I go and I take my brother's blessing, what is a blessing? A blessing is the ability to be able to fulfill your spiritual mission. So if I take my brother's blessing, I also take my brother's mission. We assume that Esau is going to check out. He's going to move to Edom. He doesn't want a part in the Jewish story. Okay, so Jacob has to take Esau's mission. If Jacob has to take Esau's mission, no surprise that he has to marry his wife. In other words, what Leah represents and what Leah's sons represent is really much more connected to Esau's personality, but Jacob has to now marry her as well. So that idea, that statement that people said, whose people? We mean the yentas in the marketplace in Haran, that's what we mean? No, people would say means, according to the Hasidic interpretation, people would say Leah is for Esau. People means the truth says. In other words, and the truth is that Leah was for Esau. Leah would be able to refine Esau, to bring Esau, to elevate Esau, etc. But Esau now is gone. So now Jacob has to marry Rachel and Leah. What does Rachel represent? What does Leah represent? Well, what does Yaakov and Esau represent? We know that, at least we said this in the past, that in some sense Jacob is Ish, or at least he starts out as an Ish Tam, as a very sincere person. He's not necessarily challenged. He sits in the tent and he's Ish Tam. Rashi says, if you're gullible, if you're not here to trick people, you're Tam, you're a complete and wholesome person. Esau is somebody that he's challenged. He's challenged with the negativity. He can also overcome the challenge. And if he overcomes the challenge, then he could actually go farther ahead than Jacob, because he has much more passion in his life. So if he'll direct the passion to the right place, he'll actually advance ahead of Jacob. Okay. So Jacob is, in other words, Yaakov is like a tzaddik, someone who's a righteous person, in other words, not too challenged. Esav is someone who's challenged but can overcome it. In some sense, Baal Teshuvah, the power to repent. Power of repentance in Judaism is, if you repent, if you sort of experience the negativity and you can escape it and transform it, you're ahead, you're more advanced of the tzaddik. Because the tzaddik never had to deal with the temptation, with the negativity. So what are we saying here? We're saying is that the same thing as Yaakov and Esav is the same breakdown between Rachel and Leah. Rachel is beautiful. Beautiful doesn't only mean physically, even though I'm sure she was physically beautiful, but it also means spiritually. Spiritually beautiful, tzaddik, no temptation, no battling with the evil. Leah internally has much more battle with her inner evil. Now, it's not a bad thing, because remember, we say that there's two paths. God creates two paths for people. Some people have the path of a tzaddik, where they're not as challenged. Other people have tremendous challenges, but the purpose of those challenges is not to bring them down, but they should overcome it. And when they overcome it, they come out ahead of the game. Jacob wants a peaceful life. He wants to marry Rachel and live happily ever after in peace and serenity. He just doesn't want the challenges. But because he took Esau's blessings, he has to bring Esau's character traits, the power of teshuvah, into his life. So he also marries Leah. Now, where do you see this all play out? I'm not just giving theories. It all plays out in the children, in the next generation. And that's the parshas we're in today, the whole rest of the book of Genesis. Trace the children of Leah, and look at the children of Rachel. Children of Rachel, more or less, are wholesome, they're complete, they're righteous. Joseph is the example. Joseph is the example who he's in Egypt alone. He doesn't succumb to the temptation of Potiphar's wife, which we read yesterday. And Joseph forgives his brothers. Yeah, I don't know if he could paint a person more righteous than Joseph. What about the children of Leah? Children of Leah are all flawed, at least the important characters. Shimon and Levi killed the whole city. Judah has the whole story with Tamar. He runs, follows the prostitute, eventually is transformed. But the point here is the road is much more challenging. Reuben himself, the Torah says he sins with Leah, with Bilhah, the mother of the maidservant of Rachel. So the rabbis don't read it literally, but the bottom line is that they all run into trouble. They all are challenged people. They're not the wholesome person that Rachel's children are. But one second, however, turns out that the greater growth comes from being challenged and overcoming it. And that's why, in the scope of Jewish history, who actually survives? It's Judah. Judah rises to be the leader of the family. It's very funny. Just like the rest of the book of Genesis, usually the person that the father chose to be the spiritual heir does not end up being it. Abraham loves Ishmael. Isaac loves Esau. Jacob loves Joseph. But Joseph doesn't become the leader. Joseph doesn't become the Bechor. He treats Joseph as the firstborn. He gives him Menashe and Ephraim, keeps treating him as the firstborn. No, but the leader of the Jewish people ends up being Judah with King David. And then also who survives is Judah. Where does Rachel and most of the Jewish people come from? Leah, not from Rachel. Leah is buried with Jacob, not Rachel, which means to say that the true growth comes from the challenge. Now, it's not surprising that Jacob doesn't want the challenge. Nobody wants challenges. So the serenity in your life is the Rachel of your life. The challenge is the Leah. So there it was two people, but for us, it could be the same within the same person, not just within a spouse, within myself. We're talking about children experiences. We're talking the bird's eye view experiences. Jacob loves Rachel. Jacob loves the righteous. I like to be unchallenged. I don't want trouble. I don't want challenge. I want peace and serenity. That's wonderful. But God is going to send me Leah. Why? Because we have some of Esau, some of that idea that this challenge and you overcome the challenge. And when you overcome the challenge, you come out ahead. That is really playing out in the first generation of Rachel and Leah and their children. And it plays out in our life as well. A lot more to say on this, but it's 10:32. So we'll take Vicky's question. We'll take a question or two, but we're already trying to wind down, but we're going to continue this next week, God willing, in good health. Go ahead, Vicky. And then Neil has a question. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Rabbi. I don't know if we have time to, maybe we can continue next week, because that's a very long journey. Maybe until Mashiach comes, we're still struggling with those questions. What is the right thing to do? What is the easiest path? But this whole scenario raises this whole a lot of questions. First of all, wouldn't it be easier if Esau indeed married Leah? Maybe she was doubting that she can transform him, but maybe she could. But
we'll get to that. We'll get to that. According to the rabbi, yes, it may have been easier, and yeah, we'll talk about that. Yeah, we'll get to that. The story is going to continue because remember, there's more things to happen here. They have to meet up Esau later. Then there's Dinah, which is the daughter of Leah, which represents the power of Leah, and at least Dinah gets a bad rap in most of the commentaries, but the Rebbe reads Dinah in a very positive light, that Dinah is trying to do what her mother should have done to Esau, which is influence the people in a positive way. So yeah, the story is going to unfold. We'll get to that.
Yeah, and the other question is kind of an answer to Mark's concern, that it's our mission to eventually transform the physical, transform those people who are so deceiving. Yeah. Because and there is no easy way to do it other than just face it and try to confront them and try to learn how to deal with them.
I agree. That's what God wanted. I agree, but I think that it's clear. I agree, but it's clear that in the simple story, both Rebecca and Isaac agree that the character traits of the people of the local girls are terrible, to the extent that they're disgusted in my life. If I'll be disgusted in my life if Jacob marries the daughter of Chet. So it seems from the simple interpretation is that the character traits of the people of Haran are better. So the question is, do we actually see that? And especially this morning, I was going after the people of Haran. So Mark says, what's going on over here? So like I said, I was a little bit stumped, but I have two answers. One answer is indeed, it's just the family. But the other answer is you have to separate between character traits, natural character traits of kindness, and then things that come with the way of life. In other words, Laban is certainly the outlier either way. But again, the simple story is that they're looking for kindness and they're going over there. So Mark's question is in place. Exactly how to answer it is also a good question. Okay, go ahead.
So I'm just going to push back and
yes,
I know that we have lots of weeks ahead on this, but
thank God.
Joseph's also a problematic character. He's not such a saint.
Yeah, everyone's problematic. Nobody is perfect, and Rachel's children also have tzadikut, also have righteousness within them. Leah's children, right? So specifically, everybody has everything. Even someone who is peace and serenity is going to have some challenge. And even someone who's challenged is going to have some peace and serenity. But if you want to paint with a broad brush, and generally speaking, what is your lifestyle? Is your lifestyle one of inner challenge, inner turmoil, where you're always struggling within yourself with your evil inclination because you're somebody who's very challenged and you have a tremendous amount of passion and energy, and you're trying to figure out how to channel it? Or you're one of the people that wake up in the morning every day for 30 years, you have the same career, you do the same thing, you don't shake the boat. It's just a different character trait. And everybody's going to have a little bit of everything, because at some point, even the person who's totally calm, when they hit my age, they're going to have a midlife crisis, right? So the point is that, yes, we're talking generally speaking, but generally speaking, you want to say Joseph is more, even in Jewish culture, we refer to him as Joseph the righteous, Yosef HaTzadik. We don't say Judah the Tzaddik. We don't say Reuven the Tzaddik, even though I'm sure they were nice people. But the point here is that's not his quality. His quality is not that he doesn't sin. His quality is that he overcomes the sin. And that's where you see the story of Tamar. Right? So that's but the point here is to trace it over. Now people understand now that trauma is multi-generational, right? So we're tracing this character trait over the generations. And then it gets funny because you get to the point where you say the same person. This applies to everybody. You marry someone, you think she's Rachel, and she ends up being Leah. And mystically speaking, Rachel is the revealed aspects and Leah is the subconscious. And you never know the subconscious of the person you're marrying. You know how I know? Because you don't know your own subconscious. So you can talk about your spouse, but you can talk about yourself. I'm in the same point. I think I'm marrying. I think I have one idea of what I look like and what I am, but then there's the deeper forces. So this could be read in on multiple layers. So Jacob thinks he's getting, he thinks he's getting peace and serenity, but he's getting the challenge. But in some sense, it's true for everybody. So that's already getting more mystical, not historical. It's getting more mystical that within every person you have the concealed world and revealed world, which is Rachel and Leah. But that I didn't get into. I jumped ahead. We'll talk about that next week on Willing and Good Health. Yasha Koach. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Happy Hanukkah. Tonight, we light the first candle. Let the light of the Hanukkah spread and warm everybody. And if you'd like, you could join us on Greenwich Avenue, lighting the menorah. It's going to be very safe because they're closing down Arch Street for the concert. So nothing to worry about. Take care. Happy Hanukkah.
Thank you. Happy Hanukkah.
Thank you.